Colonel Anderson stood in the bustling airport terminal, his mind focused on the mission ahead. It wasn't just another flight, it wasn't just another soldier to escort. This was a moment that encapsulated the very essence of his service, the duty he'd sworn to uphold. As he adjusted the folds of his crisp uniform, he thought about the fallen soldier whose remains were in a sealed casket, waiting for the journey home. A soldier who had given their life, their future, for the very freedoms he had fought to protect. The terminal was filled with the usual noise, the hurried footsteps of business travelers, the loud chatter of families reuniting, the announcements echoing through the overhead speakers. But for Anderson, the noise was distant, his thoughts consumed by the responsibility that weighed on him, the duty to ensure that the fallen soldier received the proper honor, to make sure the family knew their loved one wasn't forgotten, wasn't just a statistic, it was personal. He approached the airline counter, his boots clicking sharply against the floor with each step. The desk clerk looked up at him, her expression neutral. She greeted him with a polite but rehearsed smile. "Good afternoon, sir. How can I assist you today?" Anderson nodded, handing her the paperwork that had been prepared for the mission. "I'm here to escort the remains of a fallen soldier back home. I've been cleared for boarding." The clerk examined the documents, then glanced back at him. She seemed unsure, perhaps a little uncomfortable. It wasn't uncommon for service members to escort the remains of soldiers, but Anderson had been in uniform long enough to know when someone was uneasy. She hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "Let me just check something, sir," she said, her voice a little too calm, as if she were hiding some underlying tension. Anderson waited, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes scanning the terminal. The thought of the soldier's family, waiting on the other side of the flight, kept him grounded. He couldn't afford to think about anything else. Finally, the clerk returned. "I'm sorry, sir, but there seems to be an issue with your ticket." Anderson raised an eyebrow, his mind instantly shifting gears. He had gone through all the proper channels. He had confirmed everything beforehand. "What seems to be the problem?" he asked, his voice still calm but now edged with confusion. The clerk shifted uncomfortably. "There's a problem with the reservation. I'm going to need to ask you to step aside for a moment while I get my supervisor." Anderson's mind raced as the clerk walked away, heading toward the back office with his ticket in hand. The moment the woman left his sight, his calm exterior began to falter, though he kept his face stoic. He had escorted fallen soldiers many times before, but never had he felt the weight of his uniform so heavily. The duty was always the same, but now something felt different. Something far more insidious was at play. He stood in the terminal, trying to steady his breath, but the noise of the crowd seemed to fade into the background as his thoughts raced. What was happening? He had all the proper paperwork. There was no reason for this. Could it be a misunderstanding? Or was something else at play? He knew how deeply ingrained racial bias could be, but he had never experienced it so openly and so immediately. Not like this. The airline had been efficient in booking the flight. He had been cleared for this exact mission. No one had questioned it before. As he looked at the travelers around him, none of them seemed to notice what was happening. Everyone was going about their business, oblivious to the moment unfolding. But Anderson knew that this wasn't just a mistake, it was an injustice, and he was the one who would have to confront it. A few minutes passed before the clerk returned with a middle-aged man in a suit, his demeanor authoritative, almost dismissive. Anderson didn't need to be told who he was. This was the supervisor. The man glanced at Anderson's uniform, then down at the paperwork with a practiced motion, as if he were assessing a problem rather than a person. He cleared his throat before addressing the colonel. His voice clipped. "Official. Sir, I'm afraid there's a problem with your ticket," he said, repeating the earlier line with a cold, bureaucratic tone. "We can't allow you to board the flight at this time." Anderson's jaw tightened. "I've been cleared. My orders are clear," he said, his voice calm but firm, a professional tone that belied the growing frustration in his chest. The supervisor glanced at the clerk, then back at Anderson, as if searching for a way to explain the situation. "There are concerns regarding your status," the man stammered, clearly struggling to articulate the reason for the denial. Anderson's brow furrowed in confusion. "Concerns about my status?" he repeated, his patience thinning. "What concerns are those? My clearance was issued by the proper channels. I'm escorting the remains of a fallen soldier. This isn't a request. This is my duty." The supervisor looked around nervously, as though unsure of how to proceed. The few passengers nearby were starting to notice the tension, murmuring to one another. Anderson's words hung in the air, heavy with accusation. "I'm afraid there's nothing more I can do," the supervisor said after a long pause. "I can't allow you to board." At that moment, Anderson felt a wave of disbelief wash over him. It wasn't just the situation that stung, it was the principle behind it. They were denying him, a decorated officer, the right to perform his duties simply because of the color of his skin. He had seen prejudice in his life before, but never in such a direct and humiliating way. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, the sound of someone stepping forward interrupted him. An elderly woman, who had been standing nearby, moved toward the desk. Her eyes, sharp and full of indignation, locked onto the supervisor. "This is outrageous," she said, her voice trembling with anger but laced with a fierce determination. "This man is here on official duty. How dare you deny him?" The supervisor turned to face the woman, clearly taken aback by the confrontation. He opened his mouth to respond but was immediately interrupted by another voice. "I've been flying for decades," an older man chimed in from behind the woman, his voice carrying authority, "and I've never seen anything like this. This is wrong." A ripple of agreement passed through the small crowd, with more passengers beginning to step forward. Anderson's eyes flickered over the growing group of people, their support palpable. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about standing up against something much larger, something systemic. The supervisor shifted uncomfortably. "I understand your concern, but the rules are clear," he said, though the conviction in his voice wavered under the weight of the growing crowd. Anderson's heart raced, his pulse quickening with a mix of anger and disbelief. His instincts told him to let the situation escalate, to demand that his rights be recognized. But the voice of reason within him remained steady, reminding him that this wasn't about him, this was about the soldier whose remains he was entrusted to protect. He couldn't lose sight of that. "I'm not here for me," Anderson finally said, his voice low but filled with strength. "I'm here to ensure that this soldier is treated with the honor he deserves. You will let me board this flight, and you will apologize for this injustice." The supervisor hesitated, his face flushed with embarrassment. He knew, deep down, that they couldn't keep denying Anderson the right to perform his duty, but the damage had already been done. The humiliation, the shame, was out there for all to see. The elderly woman spoke again, her words sharp as daggers. "If you don't let him board, I'll be sure to tell everyone I know what happened here today. This isn't just about one man, it's about the kind of society we're allowing to exist." Let's take a short pause here. We'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening to our stories from? Have you ever experienced something similar in your life? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to stay updated on the next chapter. Now, let's continue. Anderson's heart pounded in his chest as the group of passengers continued to press forward, their support growing with every passing second. The supervisor, who had been standing with an air of arrogance moments before, was now visibly shaken. The faces around him were all set in expressions of disbelief and indignation, but the words of the elderly woman had cut through the tension like a blade. "This isn't just about one man. This is about what kind of society we are allowing to exist." The supervisor, whose posture had been rigid with authority, now appeared to shrink under the weight of the growing protest. Anderson stood tall, not just for himself, but for the fallen soldier whose remains were supposed to be on board. This was no longer a matter of personal pride or frustration. This was about dignity, about respect, about honoring a life that had been given in service to a nation. "I don't understand why this is happening," Anderson said, his voice controlled but his anger barely concealed. "I've been through all the proper channels. I'm here for one reason, to ensure that this soldier gets home to his family." The supervisor opened his mouth to speak, but the words never came. He glanced nervously around the crowd, then back at the paperwork in his hands. The longer he stood there, the more aware he became of how wrong the situation was, how wrong he was. The eyes of everyone in the terminal were on him now. What was once a simple administrative issue had transformed into something far greater, a fight for justice, for humanity, and for the integrity of the military service. "Let him board," a voice rang out from the crowd. It was an older man, his face weathered by years of experience, but his voice was clear, and it carried a sense of finality. "Let him do his job. This is disgraceful." The supervisor faltered, his gaze flicking from Anderson to the crowd. He had no idea how to respond, no idea how to dig himself out of this hole. His initial resistance had been rooted in an assumption that Anderson didn't belong, that he was less deserving of the same treatment as any other passenger. But now the supervisor was confronted with something he couldn't deny, the humanity of the situation, the undeniable fact that Anderson was a man doing a sacred job, a job that deserved respect, not ridicule. The supervisor began, his voice faltering, but he couldn't finish the sentence. The realization was too much. He knew, deep down, that there was no way to justify his actions anymore. With a heavy sigh, he dropped the paperwork onto the counter, his hands trembling. "I'll get you on the flight," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Anderson didn't respond immediately. His gaze was fixed on the supervisor, but his mind was elsewhere, caught in the whirlwind of emotions that had just surged through him. The frustration, the humiliation, the anger, the helplessness, all of it had built up into this moment. He had stood up. But for what? For recognition? For validation? No. He had stood up because it was his duty, because it was the right thing to do. Anderson nodded, a simple gesture that conveyed the depth of his relief and the quiet strength that he had maintained throughout this ordeal. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady. As he turned to walk toward the gate, the eyes of the terminal followed him. The whispers of the passengers around him were a mix of awe and admiration. Anderson didn't care about the attention, though. He wasn't here to be praised. He was here for the soldier. As Anderson walked towards the gate, his footsteps echoed in the quiet of the terminal. The hum of the airport seemed to return to normal. But for him, nothing was the same. The weight of the soldier's remains was heavier now, a burden of grief and responsibility that he could no longer ignore. Each step he took felt like a reminder of what he had been entrusted with, not just a duty to the fallen, but a duty to ensure that the legacy of their sacrifice was honored. The ordeal at the check-in counter had been exhausting. The indignities he had faced, the racial prejudice he had fought against, had been enough to break a man. Yet, Anderson felt no anger now. There was no room for it. As the soldiers who had trained him so long ago had taught him, there was only duty, and duty did not allow for distractions or bitterness. As he approached the gate, the woman who had spoken up earlier, the one who had called for the supervisor to let him board, gave him a small nod of acknowledgement. Anderson returned the gesture with a quiet smile, a sign of gratitude more than anything else. She hadn't known him, hadn't known the weight of the job he had taken on, but her voice had made a difference. It had helped. It had been the first spark in a small fire of resistance. He stood in front of the gate, waiting for his boarding pass to be scanned. The moment felt like a dream, as if none of it had really happened. But it had. He had been tested. He had stood firm. And now, he was about to board that plane, not for himself, but for a cause much greater than anything he could have imagined when he first enlisted. The thought crossed his mind that this moment, this quiet victory, would not have been possible without the support of those around him, the passengers who had stood with him, the woman who had spoken out, even the supervisor who had finally backed down. It was a reminder of the power of unity, of how small acts of courage could change the course of an entire situation. Anderson wasn't sure if he was more grateful for their support or if he was more proud of the fact that he had not backed down himself. "Colonel Anderson?" The voice of the gate agent pulled him from his thoughts. He looked up to see a young woman behind the desk, her face betraying no sign of recognition or surprise. There was no apology, no extra kindness, only the professional tone that came with her job. She scanned his boarding pass and gave it back to him. "Your flight is ready for boarding. We'll see you on the plane." Anderson nodded once more, his fingers gripping the boarding pass with a renewed sense of purpose. He made his way down the jet bridge, the final leg of the journey before the long flight home, before the journey that would finally bring the fallen soldier back to his family. The plane took off quietly, its engines humming steadily as Anderson settled into his seat. He tried to close his eyes, but sleep eluded him. The emotions of the past few hours swirled around in his mind, refusing to settle. The events at the airport had been a shocking reminder of the inequalities still present in society, but they had also given him something more, a renewed sense of purpose. As the plane cruised above the clouds, Anderson looked out the window, thinking about the soldier's family. He had not known the man who had fallen, but he knew the importance of his mission. He had always believed in the honor of serving his country, but now it felt more personal, more real. This soldier, who had given his life so that others could live freely, deserved to be brought home with the respect he was owed. But there was a deeper truth in the way the world worked, one that Anderson had experienced firsthand. The racial bias that had been so blatant at the airport was something he had endured many times before. It was something that had always been there, like a quiet hum beneath the surface of everyday life. But it was moments like these, moments where people stood up, where unity emerged from unexpected places, that reminded him of the power of resistance. The flight attendants passed by, offering snacks and drinks to the passengers, but Anderson wasn't interested in the small comforts of the journey. His mind kept returning to the confrontation at the gate, to the faces of the passengers who had stood with him, to the words of the elderly woman who had spoken out. She had said that this wasn't just about him, but about all of them, and in that moment, it had felt true. The thought lingered with him. and he couldn't shake it. This was bigger than one man's fight to get on a plane. This was about a system that needed to change, about an unspoken battle that had been going on for generations. He knew that change didn't happen overnight. He knew that it wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be clean. But he also knew that moments like this one, when ordinary people stood up against injustice, when they demanded to be treated with dignity, were the small sparks that could lead to something greater. As the plane continued its journey, Anderson leaned back in his seat, his hands folded over his lap. He thought about the soldier again, about the family he was bringing the soldier home to. They would never know the full story of what had happened at the airport, but Anderson would carry it with him. He would remember the way people had come together, how even in the face of prejudice and indifference, they had risen to the occasion. It was a reminder that even the smallest actions, the words of a stranger, the support of a fellow passenger, could create a ripple of change that would last long after the flight was over. The flight had been long, and as the plane began its descent, Anderson's thoughts drifted back to the moment he had been dreading. He had been to many memorials before, many burials, but this one felt different. It wasn't just about a soldier. It was about every injustice, every unfairness he had ever witnessed or endured. It was about the very real struggle for equality, and the ever-present weight of history that still shaped the present. The intercom crackled to life, the captain's voice filling the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent into our final destination. We ask that you please remain seated and secure your seatbelts. We will be landing shortly." Anderson could feel his heart rate increase. His fingers tightened around the armrest, the weight of his responsibility pressing on him even more now. The remains of the soldier were not just in the cargo hold of the plane. They were now part of a larger narrative. Anderson had been entrusted with a duty, and he knew this was more than just transporting a fallen soldier back to his home. This was about justice, about respect, about ensuring that the soldier's sacrifice was recognized by every person who stood in the way of the journey. As the plane touched down and taxied to the gate, Anderson felt a sense of finality wash over him, but it was a different feeling than he expected. There was no relief, no sense of closure. Instead, there was an unsettling feeling, as if the journey was far from over. He had fulfilled his duty, but the journey of resistance, of change, was something that would continue for as long as the injustice remained. After the plane came to a full stop, Anderson rose from his seat. Adjusting his uniform, he straightened his back, ready to honor the fallen soldier in the way he had promised, not just by escorting the remains, but by ensuring that the world saw the value of his sacrifice. As he stood up, he looked around the cabin, noting the faces of the passengers who had stood by him. They were all standing now, a silent show of respect, each person acknowledging the sacrifice that was being made, not just by the soldier, but by every person who had fought for change. It was a powerful moment, one that would stay with him forever. It wasn't about grand gestures or speeches. It was about quiet strength. It was about standing together, about acknowledging the injustices that needed to be addressed, and about the deep, unspoken connection that bound them all together. In that moment, Anderson knew that the fight wasn't over, but it had taken a step forward. The ripples of change had spread from the airport to the skies, and now, they were reaching the ground. As Anderson stepped off the plane, he felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. The memorial ceremony would begin soon, and it was in this quiet, solemn moment that he understood the true extent of what he had been a part of. The soldier's remains had been returned to his family, but the fight for justice, for equality, continued in the hearts and minds of those who had witnessed the injustice at the airport. Anderson knew that this wasn't just about a single incident. It was about a long history of discrimination that still played out in every corner of the world. People crowded around the arrival gate, waiting to see the body return to its final resting place. Anderson saw the faces of the soldier's family, their grief palpable, their pain shared by the hundreds of strangers who had gathered to honor him. But in the back of his mind, Anderson couldn't help but wonder how many of those strangers understood the deeper significance of what had just transpired. The small act of defiance at the airport, the way passengers had rallied behind him, had been a microcosm of something much larger, the movement for justice, equality, and respect that so many had been fighting for, but had yet to see realized. He didn't need to speak about it. He didn't need to make a grand speech. He understood that the power of the moment was not in the words spoken, but in the actions taken. When people stood up, when they chose to act in defiance of an unjust system, it wasn't about creating a spectacle. It was about demonstrating a quiet, steadfast resistance. It was about showing that they wouldn't accept the status quo anymore. As Anderson stood there, watching the flag-draped coffin being carried by the soldiers, he thought about the passengers from the plane, the ones who had spoken up, the ones who had stood in solidarity with him. He thought about the elderly woman who had confronted the airline employee with such calm, yet fierce, determination. In the quiet of the airport, in that moment, she had reminded everyone of something profound, that every life has value, that every person deserves dignity, and that the fight for equality is one that affects us all. Anderson felt a pang of gratitude for the support of those strangers, but he also felt the weight of the realization that the fight was far from over. This soldier's death had brought awareness to an issue that had been buried in the shadows for too long. It wasn't just about the denial of a boarding pass anymore. It was about the systemic racism that had crept into every aspect of life. And as the soldier's family prepared to lay their loved one to rest, Anderson knew that he had to continue the fight. Before we continue, take a moment to reflect. We would love to hear from you. Where are you listening from? Have you ever experienced something similar to what we've shared? We encourage you to share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. And if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe to stay updated on the next chapters. Let's keep this conversation going. And with that, Anderson took a deep breath, ready to continue the battle, not just for the soldier, but for every person who had ever been unjustly treated. The road ahead would be long, but it was one that he would walk, knowing that every small action, every voice raised, every stand taken, it all mattered. And together, they would create a future where dignity and justice would no longer be a privilege, but a right. The memorial ceremony had passed, but Anderson couldn't shake the feeling that the true battle was still ahead of him. It wasn't enough to simply return the soldier's remains to his family. The soldier's sacrifice had to mean something more. It had to spark change, and that would only happen if people were willing to see the reality of the world they lived in and confront the injustices that had persisted for too long. As Anderson stood before the soldier's grave, the weight of his uniform seemed heavier than ever. He had been to many funerals, many services, but this one was different. This was not just a fallen soldier being laid to rest. This was a symbol of a battle that was still being fought in the streets, in the courts, and in every corner of society. It was a battle that had been waged for generations, and it wasn't over yet. He placed his hand over his heart as the final words of the ceremony echoed in the air. The flag that had draped the coffin was folded and handed to the soldier's family, a symbol of the service and sacrifice that would never be forgotten. But for Anderson, it was more than just a flag. It was a reminder of the responsibility that had been passed to him, a responsibility to continue fighting for the values that this soldier, and so many others, had given their lives for. The day was drawing to a close, and Anderson found himself alone by the gravesite. The crowd had dispersed, the ceremony was over, and the air was thick with the weight of the moment. Yet Anderson stood there, unmoving. It was as though the world had paused, giving him a moment to reflect on everything that had led him to this point. It wasn't just the incident at the airport. It was a lifetime of witnessing injustice, of seeing firsthand how deep the roots of inequality ran. The soldier's family had gone, the last mourners leaving the cemetery, but Anderson remained. He thought about the support he had received, the passengers on the plane who had stood with him. He thought about the quiet acts of defiance, the moments when people had chosen not to remain silent, when they had refused to accept a broken system. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the graves, Anderson made a promise to himself, a promise that he would never stop fighting for what was right. He would carry the soldier's memory with him always, not just as a symbol of sacrifice, but as a reminder of the work still left to do. The fight was far from over, but Anderson knew that he wasn't alone. The soldier's legacy, the quiet defiance of the passengers, and the support of the people around him, they would fuel his journey forward. Anderson walked away from the grave slowly, his steps heavy but resolute. The world was not perfect, and the fight for equality would take time. But he had learned one thing for sure: change didn't come because one person stood alone. It came when people decided to stand together, when they decided to speak out and take action. And in that moment, Anderson felt the power of solidarity more than ever before. As he walked away from the cemetery, a sense of peace washed over him. He knew the road ahead would be long, but it would be a road worth traveling. For the soldier, for the passengers, and for everyone who believed in a world where justice prevailed.